Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I am absolutely delighted to moderate this event organised by the EU-UK Forum entitled Making the Northern Ireland Protocol Work. My name is Tony Connolly. I'm the Europe editor for RTE, Ireland's public broadcaster, and I've been reporting on Brexit for quite some time. Just a few words about the EU-UK Forum. It aims to facilitate and nurture a constructive and informed dialogue between the UK and its European neighbours now that a post-Brexit agreement has been reached. It's non-partisan and designed to be a platform for discussion, debate and information exchange. So with that in mind, we will very much welcome your insights, expertise and ideas during this session today. And we'll obviously take questions from people who are listening in. So I am absolutely delighted to introduce three extremely qualified guests who will bring a wealth of experience and insight, not to mention boots on the ground, into the political life of post-conflict Northern Ireland, Britain's handling of the Northern Ireland issue, Britain's handling of Brexit, and Ireland's handling of Brexit. I'm delighted to introduce, first of all, Jonathan Powell. Jonathan is the CEO of Intermediate. It's a charity he founded in 2011 to work on conflict resolution around the world. Jonathan's worked on the negotiations with ETA in the Basque Country, with FARC in Colombia, and on peace negotiations in Mozambique. He was, of course, Chief of Staff to Tony Blair from 1995 to 2007. And from 1997 to 2007, he was also the Chief British Negotiator during the Good Friday Agreement negotiations. He's a former broadcast journalist with the BBC and Granada TV. And from 1979 to 94, he was a British diplomat. He's the author of Great Hatred, Little Room, Making Peace in Northern Ireland, The New Machiavelli, How to Wield Power in the Modern World, and Talking to Terrorists, How to End Armed Conflict. You're very welcome, Jonathan. And next, I'd like to welcome Katie Hayward. Katie is the Professor of Political Sociology at Queen's University Belfast and the Senior Fellow in the UK in a Changing Europe think tank, where she leads a project on the future and status of Northern Ireland after Brexit. She's also working on a project on the governance of the Northern Ireland Protocol. She has two books out this summer, one on the Irish border and a co-authored book on Northern Ireland, A Generation After Good Friday. Finally, I'm delighted to welcome Declan Kelleher. Declan was the permanent representative of Ireland to the European Union from September 2013 to March 2020. Prior to that, he was Irish ambassador to China from 2004 to 2013. And before that, he was Ireland's ambassador to the EU Political and Security Committee in Brussels. His previous overseas postings were at the Irish Embassy in Washington, D.C. and at the Irish Mission to the UN, including during Ireland's delegation to the UN Security Council in 1981 to 1982. He's also served in the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin and worked on Anglo-Irish and Northern Ireland matters during that time as well. So I think you'll agree, three extremely well qualified guests to look at this question of making the Northern Ireland Protocol work. Declan Kelleher, first of all, you were here in Brussels at the very beginning of the universe, if you like, when it comes to Brexit and the Northern Ireland Protocol. At that time, did people anticipate the Northern Ireland question being so dominant? And if they didn't, how did you personally manage to convince them that this was a very important issue?
Thanks, Tony. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
First of all, let me say the tactics and the particular.
Yeah, I think we have a slight problem with your audio there, Declan. I'm not sure what's causing that. while we try and figure that one out, I'll just go to Jonathan Powell, and then we'll come back to you, Declan, shortly. We'll try and figure out your audio problem. Jonathan Powell, you obviously were instrumental in the Good Friday Agreement, which was a very momentous and I imagine grueling agreement to reach, whatever its relation to how difficult the Brexit agreement was. I mean, what in essence do you think was the key thing for the British government at that time in trying to find an agreement between two apparently irreconcilable tribes in Northern Ireland? And at that point, did you ever imagine that the European issue would come back to haunt Northern Ireland years later?
Well, thank you, Tony. Thank you. I'd like to start by paying tribute to Paul and to the EU-UK Forum. It's a fantastic initiative to make sure the UK still remains part of Europe, even if we've left the EU. So I really am grateful this exists, and I'm very grateful to being invited. It is rather sad when you see what's happening today, to think back to the efforts we put into making the Good Friday Agreement work. And I think the problems we have today are sort of a reflection of why we managed to make it work back in 1997 and 1998. And that is most of the problems between Britain and Ireland happen when Britain's not paying attention, when we're looking the other way. And that happens all too often. I remember a Home Office official saying to me that when he was private secretary to the Home Secretary in the 1960s, they used to get letters about Northern Ireland because the Home Office was responsible for Northern Ireland. And they'd send replies back saying it's nothing to do with us. And that's kind of been too much the British attitude. And I think why Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern deserve credit is that they really put their all into getting to a successful agreement in Northern Ireland. It was the first time, I think, that the British and Irish government really worked together with no bars at all. Even under John Major, there had been some suspicions and difficulties. But once Tony and Bertie were in place, it really worked extremely well. And they devoted a huge amount of political attention and effort to it. And I think it's that lack of attention and effort that's led us into difficulties now. When you have people who think that the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic is the same as the border between Islington and Camden, you've got a problem on your hands. I think two things that had to succeed in 97, 98, and the 9 years it took to implement the agreement after that, really were down to two things. Leadership, that on both sides, politically, as I say, prime ministers, they were there for a long time, for 10 years, and they really were determined to make it work, but actually also the political leaders in Northern Ireland. Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness were remarkably dedicated to making peace and put their lives at risk as well as their actual political future. But I think David Trimble and Ian Paisley also deserve a lot of credit. They were really strong leaders in terms of making this work. And again, that's one of the problems we have today. There's been a lack of strong leadership in the DUP. I think that leadership at the time really was what enabled us to get to an agreement. Tony Blair, in his autobiography, says that I used to say that he achieved peace in Northern Ireland because he had a messiah complex. Actually, it was Mo Molan, who you'll remember, our very colourful Northern Ireland secretary, who said to me that Tony thought he was effing Jesus, which is not quite the same as a messiah complex, but is closely related. And it is that belief that something could happen, which something Mrs. Thatcher did not believe there would be peace in Northern Ireland, nor did Winston Churchill, for that matter. John Major believed it could happen, but didn't believe he could deliver it. Tony Blair, working with Bertie Ahern, believed he could do it, believed it could be done. And because of that, we were able to get to peace at that stage.
Thank you, Jonathan. I mean, just as we speak, Michel Barnier's memoirs of his time as chief Brexit negotiator are due to be published tomorrow. I've had a read of most of the book, and talking about having a messianic complex, he describes Dominic Raab, of all people, of having a messianic glow. I'm not sure if that's a compliment. I shall have to read the rest of the book to find out. But look, I'd like to go back to Declan. I think his audio problems have been sorted out. Thanks for your patience, Declan, and everyone else. I was asking you, Declan, about when the Brexit vote happened. Your task, I think, was to educate European leaders and the European Commission and institutions that there was a clear and present danger to the Good Friday Agreement, as Jonathan has just described it.
Yes, Tony, and I hope you can hear me properly now.
Yes. Yeah.
And just also picking up on what Jonathan said, this was a matter of the most profound importance for us, and it was an all of government effort. the system, the governmental system from the Taoiseach down, had tracked very carefully the run into the British referendum. And we were fairly realistic about what we thought would happen. Ironically, one of the reasons is because we have developed very close links with British ministers and officials through our membership of the EU. So we had a little bit of a ringside seat. We also saw the British media in all its variety. So there was no great surprise when the referendum result went the way it did. The key point is, as you say, was to focus on our core interests, and there were 4 of those. And the most important was to mitigate potential damage to the peace process, and in particular, the Good Friday Agreement and the ecosystem that supports the Good Friday Agreement, North-South relations, the all-island economy, and the absence of a hard border, which had become possible after the creation of the single market in '92. And again, I think the point about the Good Friday Agreement is that its genius was it dealt with issues in the short term that had to be dealt with, but it parked other binary and divisive issues. And the problem with Brexit is that it crystallized out a number of issues that would have best been left liquid and inert, if you see what I mean. And it removed some of the nuance, it removed the ambiguities. And this was a major, major challenge as we saw it. Along with that, we have a very close relationship with the UK on trade. The common travel area also exists between Ireland and the UK. That was very easy to solve. And we also had to be mindful, and this is forgotten sometimes, that our place in the single market was also something potentially at risk. And we wanted to ensure that there was full respect for our place in the single market and the single market itself. So those were the 4 key issues. And the government, and it was very much in all a government effort, worked in capitals and in Brussels, where I had particular responsibilities to, if you like, be pedagogical, if I can use a Michel Barnier word, to explain the intricacies and explain the nuance. And things moved extremely quickly after the referendum. There was a meeting of the EU 27 heads on the 29th of June, which set out a kind of path forward. Michel Barnier was appointed not long after that. And we had a number of meetings, myself, also with colleagues from Dublin and people from many departments, with the task force in the Commission, and also with other parts of the Commission, just to ensure there was full understanding of both the nuance of the issue, the importance of the issue, and the intricacies of the issue. And it was for that reason that we insisted, and it was agreed, that the border issue, Northern Ireland, be one of the core withdrawal questions for the first phase, along with the famous question of the bill and acquired citizens' rights. I should also say, Tony, that as well as this, there was a lot of contact North-South. There was a meeting of the North-South Ministerial Council, which, as Jonathan knows, is one of the constituent bodies of the Good Friday Agreement, in July, just a couple of weeks after the referendum result. And there was agreement there that Ireland and Northern Ireland, and in particular, my office and the Northern Ireland office in Brussels should keep in touch and work quite closely on that. That became a little more difficult to achieve when the executive kind of collapsed early the following year. But I just wanted to very briefly give you a sense of the importance of the issue for us and the fact that we moved extremely quickly to educate and to canvass understanding for our position on this.
Thanks very much, Declan. I mean, it strikes me, having reported on Brexit and having just spent a few days reading Michel Barnier's memoirs of this, that to Europeans, this seemed like the UK had created this huge problem called Brexit for the island of Ireland, and the EU was going to come along with practical, pragmatic solutions to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland. But of course, there was so much politics and baggage, if you like, dragged into that process that I don't know if the EU was going to anticipate that but it became an extremely difficult political issue, not just in Northern Ireland, but obviously in the Conservative Party as well. Katie Hayward, I mean, you have been analysing and reporting and talking about this journey of Brexit and Northern Ireland to such an extent. I mean, given the week that we have, the centenary of Northern Ireland, the DUP leadership contest, looking back to the early days that Declan has described, what's your own sort of feeling about the trajectory of this? Do you feel that, in a sense, while the objectives were achieved by the Irish government, there's no hard border, that perhaps it has ended up as being a somewhat, I don't know, lopsided arrangements, because now the unionist community is unhappy, so unhappy that there's now a DUP leadership contest that could install an even more hardline person as First Minister?
Thanks, Tony, and thanks to Paul for the invitation. I really value the work of the EU-UK Forum. So yeah, it's a good point to sort of reflect back and see how much of this was predictable. And in a funny way, obviously, we are talking about borders here, whether we want to call them that or not. And inevitably, therefore, there's going to be emotional and symbolic overtones and political overtones, of course, to whatever happens vis-a-vis the future of Northern Ireland and what happens around its borders, as well as practical and technical issues. And I know coming into the beginning of Brexit proper, the 1st of January, the hope was that, in essence, there could be a sort of a low-key implementation of the protocol. It is quite surprising that UK and the EU thought in December that what was negotiated then between them very last minute about how this thing was going to be operationalized, particularly in relation to grace periods, that they ever thought that that could be possibly enough. And certainly
this was the Gove and Šefčovič agreements from December just last year.
That's right, yeah. Which they were pleased to get, and thank goodness they got them. But of course, it was never going to be enough in technical terms, given the significance of the upheaval. And you're right to pick up on maybe the EU underestimated what was going on, what the protocol was asking of Northern Ireland. And so too did GB. And this is a really interesting thing about this process, about quite how slow Britain has been, the UK government has been, in recognising that Brexit means Brexit. It affects borders. And in a funny way, there's almost this, when it comes to the reality of working out the protocol, which is like the first point at which we have the impact of Brexit proper, it's almost been like a tendency to have Brexit in name only. Could you not just turn a blind eye for a little while, or just allow us to pretty much keep things the way they were, like de-dramatize, minimize the impact? So you have a really peculiar situation now in Northern Ireland where, in many cases, those who maybe would have been Remain or didn't want this situation come about at all are the ones who are urging for the implementation of the protocol, i.e. to experience the impact of Brexit in Northern Ireland, albeit in a slightly roundabout way. And throughout all of this, I think we always come back to the question of, the responsibility of everybody on both sides to be as open and honest as possible about the reality of these new arrangements, the reality of the protocol, which obviously wasn't fully understood, wasn't fully explained, let alone clear information given on it, in order that we might create a better environment for managing the political fallout. Because as I say, that emotional and the symbolic significance of what's happened to Northern Ireland should never be underestimated. And of course, so now we have a situation everybody feels uncertain about the future, and our recent polling on the question really shows quite how anxious people across the spectrum are about what the impact of this thing might be in the longer term.
Thanks, Katie. Jonathan, to come back to you, I remember talking to a former British diplomat about 2 years ago who had, lived through the Good Friday Agreement. This was somebody from Northern Ireland, and he actually described what was happening in the UK with Brexit and with the rise of UKIP and the European Research Group as a revolution in British politics. And he said, of course, often a revolution has happened and you don't realize it's happened. And his view was that the clear casualty of that was this even-handed approach that the British government had demonstrated towards Northern Ireland. And he mentioned you in particular and and Tony Blair and the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, do you feel that you have sat through this kind of quiet revolution that has ended up with Boris Johnson being Prime Minister, with Brexit having happened? It's such an upheaval in a relatively short period of time, given how long it took to get the Good Friday Agreement to happen.
Well, it doesn't feel like a particularly quiet revolution from where I'm sitting. It seems like a rather noisy and destructive revolution. But it certainly is a revolution in terms of the attitude of the Conservative and Unionist Party. As you say, the British government took the position from Peter Brook's speech in 1991 that it was going to be even-handed in Northern Ireland. It had no selfish strategic or economic interests. And we maintained that all the way through successive governments until this government. Until the government of Theresa May, to be fair. Because Theresa May was put in a situation after the 2017 election, she had to depend on the DUP to stay in power. So it's very difficult to claim you're even-handed if you're depending on one of the parties in Northern Ireland to stay in power. She did her best, and I think Theresa May does deserve credit for the slightly Heath Robinson type construction she came up with to try and avoid having to have a protocol, to have the whole of the UK stay in the customs union. The problem was for the real Brexiteers, the Boris Johnsons of this world, that's the tail wagging the dog. Why on earth would we decide things about Brexit in Britain for Northern Ireland? Who cares about Northern Ireland? And if you don't believe that, look at the opinion polling of the people who voted for Boris Johnson as leader of the Conservative Party. They overwhelmingly were prepared to sacrifice both Northern Ireland and Scotland in order to get Brexit. These are the Tory party voters who voted Boris Johnson in. So with that attitude, it's not entirely surprising that they rode roughshod over the Good Friday Agreement. And it wasn't as if they hadn't been warned. Tony Blair and John Major went to Northern Ireland during the Brexit referendum campaign to warn of the dangers of Brexit for Northern Ireland. Someone's rights were going to get hurt. If you leave the customs union, leave the single market, there has to be a border somewhere. The talk about technology and all that nonsense we wasted several years with, it was never going to work. You have to have a border either on the island of Ireland or in the Irish Sea. In the end, Boris Johnson, to get an agreement, ditched the unionists and opted for a border in the Irish Sea. That is a far better answer than a border on the island of Ireland, but it is true that it undermines the identity of the unionists and loyalists in Northern Ireland. It's not in their face in a way that a border on the island would be, but it is a problem for them. The difficulty is that if we have Brexit, there is no alternative. So when you have people like Arlene Foster saying the protocol must go, we must replace it, they then can't answer the second question of what is the replacement? What do they want instead of it? Because there simply isn't one. We spent 6 odd years looking for one and there isn't one. So in the end, this is going to be a very difficult procedure. We're going to have to manage these very strong feelings amongst loyalists and amongst unionists more generally, and deal with the economic complications of the protocol. So the sensible thing to do is to try and make the protocol work, to be as light touch as you can on it within reason, because there has to be a border. But at the same time, that will not solve the identity problems for the unionists, but it will ameliorate the concerns about it, which may make it more manageable.
Declan, to pick up on that point, I mean, in a sense, the Irish government's strategic interests were protected in the Brexit process with the protocol. Ultimately, we don't have a hard border. We have mechanisms in place to ensure that North-South cooperation is unimpeded by Brexit. But in the end, the reality is still that, the unionists feel that they are the ones now who've lost out. I mean, is it a simple binary situation? Could the Irish government have done anything at the time to try and mitigate that sense of dejection and losing out within unionism? Or was this all simply a casualty of a rushed Brexit that was not thought through from an Irish point of view? Sorry, not thought through by the British from an island of Ireland point of view.
Well, I think the last point is absolutely right. I agree with. The other point that I'd make, though, is that let me just try and also explain the importance of the European Union for what we sought to achieve. I mean, the EU is itself a peace project, And both the Good Friday Agreement, like the Anglo-Irish Agreement before it from 1985, both explicitly situated cooperation between Ireland and the UK as friendly neighbours and partners in the European Union. So there was an assumption that they would be in the EU together. And again, go back to my earlier point, Brexit kind of dislodged that and kind of also brought out long parked constitutional issues, which are binary, which would best be left to one side. I think the other point here, Tony, is that, and I don't want to be critical, but there was a fair amount of rhetoric in the early part of the negotiations, and particularly in 2017, particularly from David Davis, if I may say so, which actually talked things up. So we had the term border in the Irish Sea was never our phrase. And there are, in any event, as you know, if you travel from GB to Northern Ireland, there are various checks, there are various bits of bureaucracy you have to deal with. And the Barnier task force and the EU were quite aware of that, and we're looking at best how to de-dramatize that. But I think the fact that for domestic political reasons, obviously having to do with kind of factionalism, Brexiteers, the ERG, etc., that issues such as a border in the Irish Sea were suddenly elevated to something constitutional. And also even, for example, that a separate customs authority on the territory of the sovereign state was something unprecedented, where of course it is precedented because the UK itself negotiated one with China over Hong Kong. I'm not saying we use Hong Kong as a template, but just as a matter of fact. And a certain amount of over-egging the pudding on these descriptions. If the rhetoric had been more restrained, if issues had been explained, if solutions had been within the British system had been canvassed more politically, I think we would be in a different situation. That's not to underestimate for 1 minute the importance of identity, which is at the core of the Good Friday Agreement. But issues were over-egged. And also, look, I mean, there was no real effort for a while to try and deal with the implications of positions. I had many visitors from the House of Commons to Brussels during my time as permanent representative. Various committees came in to see me. And there was a sort of statement, a bit like the Lancaster House, a statement that, look, we want to leave the single market. We don't want anything to do with the Court of Justice of the European Union. We don't agree with free movement of labour, but there'll be no problem on the land border in the island of Ireland, which are simply mutually contradictory positions. So I think without kind of going back over difficult periods, I think that the framing and the narrative of this issue is something that could have been done differently. And that, I think, would have led to a less intense kind of reaction on the ground in Northern Ireland.
Thanks, Declan. On that point, Katie, I mean, I suppose people can say, you know, we are where we are. The DUP voted for this. They have to own it. It's too bad. But I mean, I think you've made the point on a number of occasions that the EU and the UK, and I suppose by extension, uniquely Dublin, have a duty of care to Northern Ireland. I mean, where do you think that care is needed the most at the moment?
That's a very good question. I mean, we know that the UK-EU Specialised Committee on the Protocol and then the Joint Committee have big decisions to make. And obviously the technical decisions that they can come to will be critically important in terms of the impact that the protocol has, but also politically, and how they manage this in diplomatic terms too, about showing that that relationship is functional in the first instance and cordial, maybe at some point. I mean, we can take lessons from the British-Irish relationship and say now this is required of the UK-EU relationship. But the situation now is different to the way it could have been. And that is because the protocol is highly politicized now. I mean, it really is a live political issue and an extremely polarizing one in Northern Ireland, and it need not have been that way. And I think fundamentally,
whose fault is it that it isn't that way? Is it the messaging from the British government, especially after the protocol was agreed?
I think it's very much so. The ground for the compromise that was necessary in Brexit, and particularly in relation to Northern Ireland, the ground wasn't prepared for that compromise, particularly amongst unionists. And we saw this in official documents of the UK government, let alone in statements and rhetoric from politicians and ministers. So the reality of the protocol has come as a bit of a shock. But now we're in a situation, so in terms of responsible, yeah, I mean, the British government is responsible. And again, to refer to that polling that we've had, I mean, 5% of people trust the UK government. 5%. I mean, it's just extraordinary when you think about it. And it's only 6% for Whitehall. So again, that's pretty bad in terms of how we're going to get out of this. And the figures aren't great for the Joint Committee either. So in this environment, we have people anxious about the future. And particularly now amongst unionists, we know that they always call the withdrawal agreement the betrayal agreement. But now there is the sort of a growing sense that that betrayal could lead to abandonment, not to put too fine a point on it. And we know that in relation to the decisions around that border, around that hard Irish Sea border, I mean, that's the decision of the UK government vis-a-vis its relationship with the EU, i.e. is it prepared to have veterinary or SPS agreements, even temporary ones, to minimise the impact of that. And so always at that UK-EU relationship now, we have the impact on Northern Ireland. And as it happens, because of the protocol, that impact will be seen in terms of how committed is the UK government to the Union, to Northern Ireland's place in the Union. I mean, that's an extremely tenuous place to be. And always with the future of Northern Ireland, and Jonathan has made this point, we're completely dependent on what happens elsewhere, whether it be London and Dublin or whether it now be London and Brussels. And that dependency in a situation of distrust, for not too bad a reason, that's very that's a really destabilizing situation.
Okay, thanks, Katie. I've got some questions coming in now. If you would stay with us, Katie, because I'll just put the first one to you briefly. It's from Gavin Walker, managing editor of Business First. So Gavin's asking if Northern Ireland firms can export directly into the UK and the European single market. Is this not a blessing for unionists? I mean, I guess the ability for Invest Northern Ireland to, I don't know, trumpet that best of both worlds idea could be, difficult for them politically and sensitively in Northern Ireland. I mean, what's your quick take on the best of both worlds idea?
Yeah, well, there's no possibility really of a best of both worlds now in the context of a hard Brexit. And I think with regards to the economic opportunities from the protocol, and the majority of people in Northern Ireland do see them being economic opportunities, that would just be for a portion of the economy. It would be dependent on the UK government's continued commitment to unfettered access into GB. That's great for the time being. Will that be sustained as the UK signs up to new trade deals and finds that being a little bit awkward? Which it will, and then it's just just always that sort of the ability to be flexible in relation to Northern Ireland and how that can be worked out in terms of in every deal they're making or every decision vis-a-vis the EU or indeed other countries, how prepared they are to consider Northern Ireland's position. And yet we need stability for any economic opportunities to be achieved. And at the moment, that seems very unlikely. In fact, it's only exacerbating instability. And I should just say, just to be fair, in terms of what created this sense of instability, and I'm not going to go on and on about it, but I would say that what happened on January the 29th vis-a-vis Article 16, even for a few hours, it changed everything. And just with the EU being prepared to trigger Article 16, and this just sort of just showed the vulnerability of Northern Ireland to decisions being made elsewhere, which gets back to the original point.
Yeah, thanks very much, Katie. I have a question now from Dominic Brett, who's ex-Public Affairs Officer and ex-European Parliament. If as looks likely, the DP get a more hardline leader, what electoral interest will the party have in making the protocol work at all in Northern Ireland? Jonathan, from your experience of Northern Ireland politics, do you see the DUP somehow coming to terms with the protocol, or do you think that they will just use this as electoral kind of leverage between now and the assembly elections next year?
Well, a hardline leader in itself is not necessarily a bad thing with the DUP. I mean, Ian Paisley was more hardline than Arlene Foster, but he was determined to make the Good Friday Agreement work in practice. So what you actually want is a strong leader of the DUP who can lead it. And Arlene couldn't. She was dragged along between different factions. I think that was a problem. So I'm not so worried about a hardline leader. What I'm worried about is the very fragile political context in Northern Ireland, that we've got this leadership election, we've got an election next year. And what got the DUP going on this issue particularly, because of course in 2019, Arlene did welcome this as the best of both worlds. The problem for them was the TUV, this more extreme unionist party, support going up on the back of the protocol, going up 10%, which then meant they were the DUP was the second party and no longer going to be first minister. And I think the real danger here is that we get into a situation where the DUP feels the right thing to pull institutions down before we even get to the elections, so they don't lose the position of first minister. So I understand why people in Brussels feel it's really the responsibility of the British and Irish governments to maintain peace in Northern Ireland. That's absolutely right. But it is important they understand the politics of this. And the things they do, as Katie just pointed out, have implications. So if they can, now the British government is behaving a bit better in terms of the negotiations on the protocol, they've stopped their provocations and are trying sort of to cooperate. Now they're sort of working with the Irish government rather than refusing to. We should acknowledge that and try and see if we can't find a solution for the good of Northern Ireland. So I do worry about this period. In terms of the protocol, I think the only way out for the DUP, as I said, there is no alternative to the protocol. There's literally nothing they can suggest instead. So what they're going to have to do is make a big deal of the changes they get in the protocol when they get them. And it is in everyone's interest they get some changes they can show as a success, and then they can sort of embrace it. But that's only going to happen after the leadership election and not too close to the elections next year, or it's going to get caught up in this and we'll lose the institutions and we'll be back in the mess we were a few years ago.
I mean, Declan, you were right in the heart of all of those very difficult political and technical discussions for that whole Brexit period. Knowing the dynamics and the tensions as you do, how far can the European Commission, can Maroš Šefčovič push this flexibility line before member states really start to get nervous? And that probably leads into a question from Darren Litter, who's a PhD candidate at Queen's University, Belfast, about this idea. I think Jonathan may have mentioned it, that the UK wants to bring the border back into the Celtic Sea. You know, this idea that the island of Ireland be somehow the new kind of border with some kind of controls on goods from Ireland into the single market. But you know, in terms of what leeway the Commission has and member states have in making the protocol more flexible.
Good questions. Can I just preface the answer to the leeway point by saying that I do think, and I absolutely agree with all the sensitivities that have been mentioned by Jonathan and Katie, I do think we have to be careful not to jump on a downward spiral and get into a vicious circle. I mean, it is the fact that the benefits of the protocol have not been clearly explained. And that's a job essentially for the British government. It is the fact that the British government has hedged on its language about implementing the protocol. It is a fact, as Jonathan said, things have improved recently, that there's been some dragging of the heels on the infrastructure and the other elements to put in place the protocol at the ports. I think it'd be very important that that not continue simply because it is seen as politically tricky to do anything else. I think that has to be stopped. And I think the British government needs to be much more committed to what it signed up to in the treaty. I think there are side issues of that too. For example, it's remarkable that and the benefits have been mentioned already, the benefits of the protocol to Northern Ireland for inward investment simply have not been advertised. I suspect they haven't been advertised because there's political disagreement in the executive about doing so, saying that invest in Northern Ireland because the protocol is a good platform. That's a fact, but that's not being said. And that does affect the leeway point, because I think we have to work on the basis that the treaty has to be implemented. What's the starting point? What's the end point? And I think chipping away at the protocol has its own dangers. And again, insofar as Commission leeway is concerned, I think it's very important to be aware that there's more than the Commission involved in this. If there's a particular reflex on SPS, on sanitary phytosanitary, if there's a particular reflex on state aids, I think it's pretty clear that those reflexes in the Commission reflect the view in Paris on phytosanitary and in Berlin on state aids. So the Commission is not a free actor. The Commission has to observe the treaties, has to observe how it handles other relations with third countries, and also how it responds to the member states. On the Celtic Sea point, well, I suppose the kind of the reductio ad absurdum of that is that why doesn't Ireland rejoin the UK? I mean, it goes back to my point right at the start that protecting Ireland's place in the single market is something which is important for us. The British government has agreed to in the text of the treaty, and we cannot allow Brexit to be a situation which de facto pulls Ireland out of the single market or turns Ireland into a kind of yellow pack member of the single market. And if I understand the Celtic Sea point correctly, I think that's something we need to be very careful about.
Yeah, just another quick one for you, Declan. A very easy question here from Professor Ben Chonra at UCD. Does Ireland's diplomatic success on Brexit presage the potential collapse of the Good Friday Agreement? There you go.
No, I don't think it does, because the Good Friday Agreement was the result, and Jonathan can speak on this with absolute authority, was the result of an enormous amount of effort, and also was the culmination of the work, in fact, of decades, if you like. I mean, Seamus Mallon once famously referred to it as Sunningdale for slow learners, and Sunningdale was from 1973. So I think, I don't agree that it does presage the collapse of the Good Friday Agreement. What I do think, however, is that the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement, both North-South and East-West, and the workings of the Good Friday Agreement need to be as resilient and fit for purpose as possible, because I think over the next few years, the institutions and those mechanisms are going to be at a premium, are going to be very important. So far from the Good Friday Agreement collapsing, I just think it needs to be worked more. Even now, at the present time, and I'm glad to see, again, picking up something Jonathan said, that the British government is now more agreeable to meetings of the East-West bodies.
Okay, thanks, Declan. Jonathan, do you want to pick up on that?
Yes, no, I do. I strongly agree with Declan on all the points he made, and particularly on that last point. If this is going to work, the British government is going to have to pay attention to Northern Ireland, and that means not just the Northern Ireland office, but also Number 10. There is a problem. You know, we spent probably too much time on Northern Ireland in Tony Blair's government, but governments subsequently, from Cameron onwards, have tried to push Northern Ireland out of 10 Downing Street and make sure they're not involved in it. And I understand that, because they have time and they want to focus on other things. But it's a mistake, because you have to be constantly managing this. And as Declan says, you have to manage it with the Irish government. I actually think the delay with which they were prepared to engage with the Irish government after this latest trouble was a real problem. But I think we should also say there's another issue at work here, which is the loyalists themselves. I know the loyalists are difficult for people to understand from outside of Northern Ireland, but they are a serious issue. They did get left behind by the Good Friday Agreement. Their communities are dominated by these horrific gangs that make it impossible for the police to crack the criminal work that's going on there because of the threats they make to the people there. But we have not, the British government this is, we have not spent enough time trying to engage with the loyalists, hard work as it is. These are areas, I mean, if the statistic is correct, I'm not quite sure, but it's pretty haunting if it is, that the lowest level of educational attainment in the EU are in some of the loyalist enclaves in Belfast. That's a pretty shocking statistic for a country like the United Kingdom. And we've got to do some more about the loyalists if we want to address this problem, as well as dealing with the problem of Brexit and the other issues.
How would we do that, Katie, do you think? And I can just sort of segue into a question here from Liam Roach from Roach Consulting, which is, would the panel agree that while the Good Friday Agreement achieved peace and governance, progress towards reconciliation has been slow? The Civic Forum in the Good Friday Agreement is not operational. I mean, I guess this is fairly self-evident, Katie, and is now a very important question.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, nobody really very few people talk about reconciliation in Northern Ireland anymore. Although I have to say, there has been some really good contributions and positive contributions in relation to the centenary, which has been quite carefully handled, including by the church leaders on the island of Ireland. So, so I would just say, so in relation to DUP unionism and loyalism, I mean, one reason why this issue becomes so politicized and polarizing is because it's been possible for people to present, or indeed to fear, that the protocol is a threat to the union. So then if you want to temper that somewhat, you know, and to calm down those fears, how do you do that? And this gets to a really interesting question for the British government, because in some ways you could say, in relation to negotiating the protocol and what it was trying to do then, whether we were talking about Theresa May or Boris Johnson, they were trying to have a sort of a pragmatic approach to an extraordinarily complicated problem. And obviously, according to the Good Friday Agreement, they are compelled to act with rigorous impartiality as the sovereign government in Northern Ireland. It's not right, therefore, that a sort of an overtly unionist bent now comes forward to try and calm unionist fears. I don't think that's the right way to go about it, because not least because it risks, you know, inflaming other concerns. This is all about balance. And in some ways, it's about addressing some pragmatic, practical issues, which is really where we have the real test of Brexit and indeed the UK's commitment to Northern Ireland, which is about how much is it prepared to compromise on the hardness of Brexit for Northern Ireland's, for the ease of Northern Ireland. So it's just a very strange thing. Nobody would have wanted it this way, but the UK's decisions vis-a-vis the EU always comes back to hitting the place the hardest. And interestingly enough, looking at the data and indeed listening to loyalists, many of them, not all of them, many of them are open to the more pragmatic approach. So you do see supporters of the PUP, Progressive Unionist Party, for example, saying, well, why not have this SPS agreement? You know, what's stopping the UK government in this? Looking for practical solutions and recognising that this is a choice that the UK government still has to make. And so this is a sort of, the more they can be honest about those decisions and why they don't want to do them, and honest about, well, these are the consequences of not aligning, the better it will be, and the more assured, the more clear it will be for unionists and loyalists as to where they stand.
I mean, I suppose one of the real sore points for unionists, and this is, you know, across the board, you know, people who are able to measure their identity in small shifts in inconvenience in everyday life, like not being able to receive parcels, not being able to buy the Lincolnshire sausages that might have a Union Jack flag on them, or label on them. I mean, in a sense, the British argument at the moment is, look, do these things really pose a risk to the integrity of the Good Friday of the single market or to consumer health? I mean, these are sausages produced in the UK, high standards of food safety. Is there not a fair point being made there that the EU should be more pragmatic on these issues? Katie, if I can just get you on that briefly.
So yes, I mean, flexibility and pragmatism. So the flexible and imaginative solution for Northern Ireland in the protocol, I mean, that didn't finish with the protocol, that wasn't it. And interestingly enough, I was reminded recently that Peter Brook used the same phrase in relation to Northern Ireland: flexible or imaginative and flexible solutions needed to manage Northern Ireland, which I'd forgotten. So yeah, it will continue to be needed. And I think that the scope for decision making in the Joint Committee is quite significant, not least that responsibility to sort of maintain conditions for Northern Ireland's place in the internal market and North-South cooperation, notwithstanding the realities of the legal framework that has been agreed. So I think this will continue to be, it won't be negotiation, but it'll certainly be movement needed and a relationship needed on both sides. in order to create those conditions in which, if you like, the protocol impact is de-dramatized, because we are feeling it. I mean, all of us are feeling the effects of it, because this is what Brexit is, and it's uncomfortable. And I think the worst thing is knowing that it's going to get worse. And so the sooner we have a clear movement from the EU, setting out, we heard you on this, and this is something jointly agreed with the UK, this isn't unilateral action or anything, then the better it will be for getting into the situation whereby this seems to be, reasonably implemented in such a way that, yes, we don't want to see businesses closing down, or more burdens and increased prices on consumers, etc.
Yeah. Declan, on that point, I mean, it's been said to me by a number of people here in Brussels that, Ursula von der Leyen is of the view, and her cabinet are of the view that Brexit is done. They need to kind of move on. The UK agreed to all this. Then, what's the problem? We can't be bending over backwards. And then, of course, there's the Article 16 misadventure, which Katie referred to. I mean, are you concerned that there's a bit of loss of sort of institutional memory now that there's she's not a new Commission president, but she wasn't, if you like, blooded in the Brexit Good Friday Agreement protocol process that Jean-Claude Juncker was involved in?
Well, I mean, the Commission is a continuity, so presumably they have ways and means of ensuring they don't lose institutional memory. But I think you raise an important point, and it's actually something my former opposite number and good friend Ivan Rogers used to say, that Brexit is a process, and Brexit is a process, and the effects of Brexit will go on for a long, long time. And I don't think anybody would really see Brexit as a box ticked. I mean, the Brexiteers might, but Brexit, the effects of Brexit and the disruptive effects of Brexit will go on for a very long time. I think the incident of the 29th of January that Katie's referred to was clearly a terrible mistake. It was very quickly cleared up. I do think it's unfortunate that it has kind of now been broadcast, particularly in the British media, as a sort of an example of one of the most appalling casus belli of all time. I think it was a terrible mistake. It has been corrected. One assumes and one hopes and one insists it will never happen again. So I think that's damage was done. Katie has very eloquently pointed to the damage, but I think it was an error. One point, and again, if I can take up something Katie said on SBS, and it's this. One of the interesting differences between the Johnson administration and the May administration is the importance they attach to the joint political declaration, which accompanied the withdrawal agreement. The May government saw this and tried to elevate this almost into a quasi-legal parallel text. The Johnson administration, even though the wording is pretty well the same, basically ignored it. The reason I mention it is that if the Johnson administration were prepared to look more creatively and thoughtfully at the joint political declaration, there are potential solutions there on things like SBS. The whole point about the joint political declaration, it was to look at the future relationship, and the concept of it was scalability, that you balance rights and obligations, you scale up, which was the theory for May. Johnson, you not only scale down, you move away from it. But there are paragraphs in there, there's wording in there on SBS, which could be used for veterinary agreements, and I think ought to be looked at as a possible way of just addressing the point that Katie's referred to and your point about Lincolnshire sausages.
Yeah, thanks, Declan. That brings me neatly to a question from John Peat, who's the political and Brexit editor of The Economist. And this one's for you, Jonathan. Is there any chance that the Johnson government would accept EU food and veterinary standards, which would be the best single step towards minimising checks? And I suppose just to add a sort of a sub question to that question, Jonathan, I mean, we have viewed Brexit entirely through the lens of conservative governments and conservative leaders, because they've been in power since 2011. I suppose there will come a time one suspects that there will be a Labour government or a non-Conservative government. Do you see that being a potential development in the future relationship between both sides? But first, just on the SPS agreement, do you think Johnson might be tempted to go down that road?
I think John's question is actually the central point at the moment. This is the most important issue. The trouble is, if it's treated as a zero-sum game, you've got a problem, because the Brits aren't going to agree to something that stops them getting their much vaunted agreement with the free trade agreement with the Americans, and that will have to include agricultural clauses. So they're not going to agree to the full SPS package, which will be by far the most logical thing to do, by far the best thing to do to solve the problems of Northern Ireland. But I'm afraid that's where we come back to the tail wagging the dog as far as they're concerned. So they're not going to do that. And the EU obviously can't, and France certainly isn't allowed, which is something that allows chlorinated chicken to come rushing into the single market. But I do think there is something, if you don't treat it as a zero-sum game, that you can make some pretty practical compromises that may make this work. They're quite difficult, but I hope that's what the two sides are looking at, and it certainly is doable. And I think that they may be able to get there, and that will be the best we can hope for, because they won't get the full benefit otherwise of this. They won't solve the problems in a way that will quieten down Northern Irish politics. On your question on the Tories, I mean, to pick up something Declan said, this is a process, as Ivan said. This isn't over. Unfortunately, this problem in Northern Ireland and Brexit in the EU is going to continue. This border is going to get wider over time, because presumably the point of Brexit was to diverge from the EU standards. So as we diverge, you're going to have more items that have to be checked. You're going to have more provisions that need to be considered by the Joint Committee. So this is going to get worse rather than better. And that then has implications for the attitudes towards the United Ireland. You know, if you're a businessman in Northern Ireland and your economic life is being controlled by what decisions made in Brussels, you want a voice in that, and you're going to be looking to Dublin rather than to London to have that voice. And that's what's underlying the concern on the unionist side. They are worried this is all part of the inevitable march to United Ireland, and that's why they get quite so upset about things that most people would think were not so serious. So I think this is a long, and by the way, that has some pretty important implications for Scotland, because this will then impact on Scottish independence, and anything that happens on Scottish independence is going to impact back on a border poll in Northern Ireland. So long term, I think we've got a real problem on this issue on Northern Ireland, and an existential question for the United Kingdom. Would a Labour government handle this better? Yes, I'd like to think so, but they still have to deal with the problems that are there. The problems have been created by Brexit, and they're not going to go away just because you have a Labour government, because unfortunately a Labour government is not going to be able to reverse Brexit, at least anytime soon. So we're going to have to live with these problems. We're going to have to find a way of managing them. I think that's the key point.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. I'm just mindful of the time now, so it's nearly 3 o'clock. So what I'd like to do is just have a quick final thoughts from the three panelists. And I suppose with the week that's in it, we've got elections, we've got most notably Scottish Assembly elections, and the question of Scottish independence is obviously going to weigh heavily on Brexit and Ireland, and the whole question of whether Brexit might somehow precipitate a united Ireland. Declan, I mean, what difficult question, but like, what are your own horizons on this like at the moment, given that we do seem to have quite a few contradictory opinion polls back and forth, but do you see Brexit and the protocol as eventually settling down and people just live with it and get pragmatic about it, or do you think this has set in motion forces which are now hard to control?
I think the challenge is to be pragmatic, and the challenge is to get things to settle down. And that's certainly the view that the Irish government is taking. I mean, the Taoiseach Micheál Martin has recently established a kind of what he calls a shared island unit. And I think the point is there, we just build on what has been achieved. There has to be much more reaching out. The Dublin side, we reach out as much as we can. I do think, I agree with Jonathan, if I may say so, as an outsider, that I think the British government needs to become much more engaged and involved, as previous Conservative governments were, as the John Major government was, for example, and that John and Tony Blair took over from John Major. But I mean, if you look at even the pattern of attendance at things like the British-Irish Conference, if you look at British Prime Ministerial patterns of attendance at some of these Good Friday Agreement meetings, they've been extremely patchy in recent years. I think that has to be got back up to speed. And I would say, yes, visions. Well, look, if you have visions, you should take a tablet. It's better to be pragmatic.
Okay, thanks, Declan. Jonathan, do you have visions or horizons, or are you taking tablets for where Brexit is going to lead us all?
I worked in Northern Ireland long enough to know I should keep taking the tablets. But I'll be very brief because we've run out of time. But I'm basically optimistic. We're not going back to the Troubles. This will, I think, settle down. But people would make a big mistake if they underestimated how fragile the situation is. And by inadvertent action, you could tip this into a crisis where the institutions go down, where you get loyalists rioting, and where they then go to the interface areas and engage with people egged on by dissident Republicans. None of us want that. So we should all try and work pragmatically, as Declan says, to try and avoid that. And I think it can be done.
Katie, your final thoughts on this?
Yes, so I mean, it's not going to go away as a political issue anytime soon, because you have the consent vote on Articles 5 to 10 at the end of 2024, which is has been seized upon, and is people are very conscious of that now in Northern Ireland. So in that poll we conducted in Lucid Talk, only 4% of our respondents said they didn't care how their MLAs voted on that particular issue, and it will affect how they vote for a particular candidate. And it's almost half and half in terms of whether they want them to vote to scrap Articles 5 to 10 or whether they want them to be kept in full. So we can see that this is really a live issue, which comes down essentially to unionism and nationalism, and therefore the importance of that British-Irish relationship, and now, of course, the UK-EU relationship, acting only in full consideration of the fact that whatever they do in Northern Ireland is carefully watched and has huge ramifications politically, socially, culturally, and even for peace.
Thank you very much, Katie. I know we've had quite a few questions come in, and I must apologise that we didn't get to them all. But I would like to extend a very warm thanks to our panelists for a fantastic discussion. Jonathan Powell from Intermediate, Declan Kelleher, former permanent representative of Ireland to the EU, and Professor Katie Hayward of Queen's University Belfast. This has been a really thought-provoking and challenging discussion that I hope you've all enjoyed. And as far as I'm aware, there will be a link to the recording of this sent out from next Monday. For now, I'd like to thank you all for attending. And I think we will have just a final video before we say goodbye. But it's been a pleasure for me, Tony Connolly, RTE's Europe editor, to host this forum by the EU, this discussion by the EU-UK forum. Thanks to Paul Adamson and Rebecca Matheson for setting it all up. And once again, thanks to the panelists for a fantastic discussion. Thank you.